Welcome to episode 5 of Train Story Tales. I'm starting out outside today to show you this. It's an underframe or chassis for one of our Bogey Coaches. So far we've looked at the four-wheelers. Short, the longest is about 10 metres long. Our Bogey Coaches are twice that length, which makes them far more economical. And when we're carrying passengers, our first train consists of 5 Bogey Coaches. The Bogey is this truck, you'll see one at each end of the chassis, and it's pivoted on a central point. It's got lots of springing. The extra springing means that it's a far more comfortable ride than if you're riding on a rigid axle, especially if you're sat right over the axle in a four-wheeler. The other advantage is, because of the separate pivot points, it means that it irons out corners. So as well as a smoother ride up and down, it's a smoother ride from side to side as well. This is the Bogey coach that we have in Train Story. It's number 4145, built in 1911 for the South East and Chatham Railway. When the railway was first set up, this and its sister coach were amongst its first acquisitions. And because of the origins of it, they're both referred to as Chatham coaches. This one is awaiting restoration. When it first came to the railway and was used, it was used not to carry passengers, but as living accommodation and mess room for all the volunteers. When you visit our site these days, it's hard to imagine what it was like in 1971 when the rolling stock was brought here. Then there was literally just a semi-derelict gas house and the waiting room and signal box, and that basically was it. There was nowhere for volunteers to have anywhere to sit down, nowhere for them to take cover, nowhere for them to eat. And so this coach and its sister were both pressed into use, as I say, as sleeping accommodation and mess room. Why does it need restoration? Well, the problem we have is that because these carriages served on the Isle of Wight, they spent a lot of their time on Ryde Pier. On a day like today, Ryde Pier is a lovely place to be. But in the depths of winter, when it's high tide and a storm, the seawater basically gets splashed all underneath of these carriages. That resulted in a huge amount of corrosion. And when they were first put into service, they were okay, but then it was realised that they were rotting very quickly. And we've actually had to construct new underframes for these carriages. That's not an easy task. We actually had to go to Europe in order to find someone who was able to extrude the necessary profile that we needed to build the underframes for these carriages. But they are slowly getting back into use. When this carriage was originally built, it had 7 passenger compartments and a guard section. But for the Isle of Wight, they wanted a larger guard section and fewer passenger compartments. And so 3 were lost and this guard section was enlarged. You can see behind me that there's a display of luggage here. This is perhaps a slightly scruffy, well-used example of what could be termed an Edwardian gentleman's travelling portmanteau. You'll see on the right the hangers allowing him to put his suit in there, drawers, and also compartments. And it all closes up into a big chest, which no doubt his servants would have carried for him onto the train. And we also use it for the audio presentation of the story of May Joyce. May Joyce was a lady who joined the railway service in 1945. In effect, the railway up until then was basically male employees. But of course, in wartime, many were lost to the forces, and so women started to be employed, and May Joyce was one of those. Initially employed, I believe, as a ticket collector at Cowes. When she was made redundant, they actually asked her to come back as a porter, and she used to work out of Blackwater. And the story of May Joyce is how she met an engine driver. They started courting, literally on the train. He was always be the relief driver if her driver was off sick or on holiday. They formed a relationship, married and had children, and indeed her descendants come here every year to listen to the story of their ancestor. It's not just carriages which use bogies. Here you see a bogie from our locomotive. This actually is a spare. It's for our Calburn locomotive, and you can see the central pivot point there and the two large leaf springs upon which the weight of the locomotive is carried. This goes at the rear of the locomotive, and again it enables a slightly smoother ride, but more importantly it enables it to go around tight corners. One of the great things about being a guide here at Train Story is that we're often asked questions. I don't know it all, and about 3 years ago a young boy, perhaps aged 9, came up to me giggling slightly to ask why they're called bogies. I told him that I didn't know, but it was nothing to do with the bogies up his nose. Well, I was wrong. Because of his question, I went away and made some inquiries and found out why they're called bogies. In folklore, a bogie was a mischievous spirit, someone who'd make things go wrong. And it was first applied to wheels, I think, when people used to cut down trees in forests or woodland and have to drag the trees out. You've probably seen old pictures of dray horses or shire horses pulling logs, sometimes just dragging them on the ground, with larger logs, perhaps with a wheel and only the far end being dragged on the ground, but with really boles of trees, the very long, heavy ones. They used to mount an axle at the back of the tree. This axle was fine, it made it roll smoothly, it could be pulled out, but the problem was, if it wasn't put on at exactly 90 degrees to the tree, it meant that the back went out of line and started going diagonal. And of course the lumberman would swear that he'd put it on perpendicular or at right angles, and that something had interfered with it and that's why it was having problems. So it was called a bogie, blaming it on the mischievous devil. In modern day use, a bogie is used particularly in America in the Air Force, where a bogie is the term applied to an enemy missile. The idea being to minimise it, to say it's an annoying thing. Well, that's putting it mildly. And those lumps of solidified mucus up your nose, which annoy you, they got called bogies for the same reason. But the great thing is on the railway, the bogies aren't a nuisance. They are essential to the smooth running and the smooth journey of our trains. Well, that's it for this episode, a bit shorter than previously. Thank you for viewing it, I hope you found it interesting. We're now open to the public, and next week we're going to be opening full time to the public, and so there's not going to be the opportunity to film some more of these until the autumn. So join me then when I'll be talking about some of our locomotives, starting with our Terrier Locomotives that we have here in Train Story. Thank you for viewing. Goodbye.